Tracy Martin.
Kia ora, Mr Speaker. Thank you very much. Just to pick up on the last part of Catherine Delahunty's contribution, in fairness to the universities, not a single university came and submitted and said they wanted to open a charter school. Not a single one. The only organisation that came to submit and said they would like to open a charter school was the Manukau Institute of Technology and Mr Stuart Middleton. So universities never asked this government to open up the opportunity for them to open charter schools. I can only assume that the only organisation that did was Mr Stuart Middleton from the Manukau Institute of Technology, and it's of interest how much influence he appears to have had that we have it inside this legislation when nobody else wants to do it. But that would be the first thing. Can I pick up on this? The next thing is a couple of statements made by the Minister. Just to be clear, New Zealand First will be opposing the bill. Just to be clear, let's just get that out there. I know it's a shock horror to you, Mr Speaker, but I thought I'd better put it on the record just in case there was any misunderstanding about where New Zealand First is going here. Now, the Minister mentioned in her contribution that about 40% of the schools here in New Zealand have less than 100 to 150 students. She's right about that. For those very small schools that are 50 to 100, they have what's called teaching principals. So that is where, the schools between 50 to 100 are called U1 to U3 schools. This government has recognised that they've actually had a great deal of difficulty finding principals to take on those positions in those schools, to the point where previously this government has offered an extra $50,000 a year on top of the standard salary of a U1 to U3 principal to encourage principals to go out into U1, U3 schools. In those U1, U3 schools, our most rural of schools, held some of the most challenging of our behaviours because they are so isolated. What happens when you are a teaching principal in those schools is you do not have the access to the resources inside the urban centres. But instead of actually coming up with a rural solution, as New Zealand First has inside the manifesto, where we would establish an early intervention staffing component for a full-time teaching equivalent for every Year 1 to Year 3 school, so that we can support the students and the principals who are the learning professional leaders of those schools, this government has decided to take principals out of those schools. Out of those schools. And I don't blame the members of the government members of the Education and Science Select Committee. The reality is they are so ignorant about how education actually works that the bovine scatology that Minister Parata can feed them with is accepted by them and just swallowed. And then they stand in this House and try to justify what they don't understand. So they accept this from a minister. So this is the reality of what's happening with regarding to this piece of legislation enabling a principal to manage more than one school. This is because the members of the government believe that the principal is merely a CEO, does not understand what a leading learning professional inside a school does. And I would have thought that Minister Bridges, having sat on the Education and Science Select Committee for a short period of time in the last term and listened to some of the evidence that was provided, would have stood up for the fact that principals are vitally important inside and on the ground in their schools. But no, because there is this misunderstanding by the members of the government benches that this is a CEO position, they're more than happy to go ahead with it. So instead of supporting some of the most vulnerable, some of our most isolated, some of our most rural, with more resourcing, they're going to take away the learning leader of the school. That's the first reason why New Zealand First will oppose this bill. The other thing that's very interesting, let's get to Teach First NZ. Now what it's called is employment-based trainee teacher salaries. This is quite clearly, and it's already been a pilot, is the fact that these are graduates. They've done a 3-year degree, could be in whatever. They've done an 8-week block course over a Christmas period, and then they are in work training, basically. They're placed inside a classroom, and up to this point, they've been incredibly well supported by the University of Auckland. There's been 20 inside the environment. It is of incredible interest, Ms Delahunty referred to and Ms Salisi referred to, the interaction that took place at the Education and Science Select Committee when, after the first round of public consultation, suddenly a supplementary order paper appeared, putting this employment-based trainee teachers into this piece of legislation. And there was a massive fight at Select Committee. The relationship at the Education and Science Select Committee almost completely broke down because there was no intention of the government to go to public consultation about this change. And I went and had a conversation with the Teach First NZ founder, actually, and I asked them why had they moved away from the arrangement that the Ministry of Education, Teach First NZ and the PPTA had come to, whereby how Teach First NZ graduates were actually breaking the law was, it was schools that were breaking the law in the fact that they did not advertise the positions publicly for the jobs that they then placed those students in. And he said to me, it was news to us. It was news to us. We only found out 3 days before that supplementary order paper was placed on the table of the Select Committee. So I'm going to suggest that the reason why originally this government did not want any public consultation around that supplementary order paper is because they didn't want it to be made public through the submission process by the teachers' unions, who have every right, like every other citizen in New Zealand, to participate and place their voice inside this legislation, if only the government would every now and then actually listen to them, listen to the professionals, listen to the people who have trained and taken years of their lives to dedicate themselves to the education of children. This government continues to suggest that when the educational professionals don't agree with them, it's because they're self-serving. This is the sector that stayed in the classroom when this government didn't pay them because they stuffed up and overpaid. These are the people that stayed on the job, making sure that children could still come to school, would still be educated, even though they weren't paid because this government stuffed it up. But no, when they don't agree, when they stand up for things that they know are going to disadvantage children, this government suggests they are self-serving. So I would suggest that that was the reason why the Select Committee originally, the majority, did not want to reopen the submission period. It was very clear that a directive had been given, and it's only on the hard work and the tenacity of the opposition that that situation changed. So let's be clear also that the reason given by Teach First NZ why these graduates don't just go on to do the one-year teacher training that they could just do to actually be a fully qualified and registered secondary school teacher is because of the student loan scheme. It's because the gentleman said that it was because it cost too much money and that they needed to go and get a job. So I would suggest to Teach First NZ and anybody else out there, they should vote New Zealand First at the next election so that our upfront investment tertiary policy comes into play so that we wouldn't need to then put apprentices inside our classrooms to teach our children. They would actually have fully funded teaching places so we could put 100% qualified and registered teachers into our classrooms for children. That is a solution to a skill shortage. A little bit of workforce planning wouldn't go awry either. A little bit of workforce planning, but that is a solution to a skill shortage, not putting an apprentice in front of our children. And now, under this bill, because the government refused to support the supplementary order paper, these apprentices can be in front of 5-year-olds. In front of 5-year-olds, all the way through to 18-year-olds. Mr. Smith, don't argue with me, you know it, well, you won't win. Now, and in closing, sir, there are so many things wrong with this piece of legislation. That is only two. But unfortunately, I don't have enough time to impart the rest of my wisdom upon the Parliament. Mr. Smith, I can see you later if you would like a one-on-one lesson about what actually happens in education. But New Zealand First will oppose this bill.